Well, I guess I'll get started. Hopefully some other people will roll in. And this is this is a brand new panel for me, which you get to be guinea pigs on. I'm a big old science nerd, but for the interest of transparency and credibility, my name is Frank Coy. I'm actually, my day job, I am a molecular biologist. I've been working here in Austin for well over 20 years for the Ushicon company, that's a biotech company, biotech brand. And I want to bring that up so that way you know that I do know a little what I'm talking about. And what I am talking about is how biology is being used in sci-fi and television and movies. And sometimes they do a great job, and sometimes they don't. And when I talk about use of biology, I mean applying real concepts, and how do we incorporate that into the fiction? Because obviously, it's not going to be completely accurate because that makes for a boring story. But let's just say I'm going to pick on Star Trek a lot. But first, I'm going to go in more detail. What I mean is that there is a good way and a bad way of doing it. And one is how does sci-fi get it right? And I'm not talking necessarily about, I am talking about TV and movies, mostly television. And one is research. Getting the real knowledge and not just simply making stuff up because it's kind of cool. And that is not necessarily something that is recent, although it happens more often in recent years that people do their research because you have the internet, so you don't have an excuse. But writers back from the 60s did their homework and they were able to apply it. The other thing is what I saw calling staying true to the concept. A lot of entertaining science fiction takes an idea in its core and just plays with it and exaggerates it, where we are hitting sometimes the realms of fantasy. And that's okay, as long as you're not compromising what that core idea is. And then it's easier to suspend disbelief, or at least it's easier for us scientists to suspend disbelief. Next, there's a thing I call internal logic. Sometimes you can make stuff up, but they need to make sense. As opposed to, I'm just going to make up my own rules because we're convenient. Because otherwise, that's lazy writing. And again, then there's the thing there's the whole keep it simple, stupid. Because one of the big problems is, again, it's that whole suspension of disbelief. When people over-explain things, or they try to make, you end up blowing a can of worms. You really do. Sometimes it's simpler to just say, it's this. And don't go any further, because then the audience can accept it, or even we can accept it. And where a lot of these shows sometimes get it wrong, is again, they're just making it up as they go on. They don't consider, is this real? Or they'll take an actual, what's known as dogma or established concept at the time, and they'll just say, no, I don't care, I don't like that. Or they'll contradict it, but they don't take the time to say, I'm contradicting something that's established. I have no problem with shows. Doctor Who did a thing where they totally changed the whole concept of the second law of thermodynamics in an old Tom Baker. But the problem was they never bothered to tell the audience that they were contradicting the established second law of thermodynamics. And it would oh, yeah, I'm sorry, this doesn't make any sense. And then again, when you try to be too realistic and you try to fill in every detail, you just go down this path. And it ruins the story sometimes. And I'm going to talk about several categories, and it's basically not examples of when it goes wrong, but also examples when it goes right. And so I'm not just going to be spending an hour bitching. But as I said, I am going to pick on Star Trek. And when I talk about internal logic, I'm going to give you an example. Back in the 90s on the old TV show The Flash, this scientist screwed with the Flash by shooting him with a concentrated amount of insulin. So all his blood sugar got screwed up and he couldn't run. And so even though there really isn't a drug that deals with it, the concept was sound. Or it's like the whole idea of one way you could like screw with a vampire is to like infect him with thrombosis, so any blood he takes in gets coagulated and it's useless to him. Ding! But, okay, first thing we're going to talk about category is pathogens and viruses. This is an easy one for me to pick up. And I'm going to go with an easy target. Mistress of Science. Is anybody old enough in this room to have seen the Mistress? Oh, the cameraman. Okay, this was the first TV series Courtney Cox was in. There she is, very young. And the thing about this is basically a pseudo superhero science fiction. They had powers. They would be hired to like fight crime or deal with the situation. And in this situation, they were asked to help protect this biolab facility against animal rights activists who were like basically like the ALF, which were terrorists. And what happened was the whole thing in the basic plot line was a scheme where they had the owners of the lab had a secret deal with the leader of the terrorists to actually raid their lab, so to spread this infection, and they in turn would rescue everybody. Now, here's the only problem with it. Basic classic show. Nobody on the show knew the difference between an antibody and an antigen. Basically, they kept saying, well, one of the rabbits we have to rescue is producing antigens against the disease. And it was repeated a couple of times. And here I was back then in 1985 saying, technically the antigens are the disease. You're making antibodies. Please, nobody does. But notice this was a dopey show, so you can kind of excuse that. But you can see what I'm talking about. Like, that's an easy thing that you could look up in a book. When I talk about lazy writing. Okay, remember I said I was going to pick on Star Trek? Because Mistress of Science was not the only show that didn't know the difference between an antigen and an antibody. But we'll get to that. What they don't know is this was an episode of Voyager where the crew gets infected by this parasite. They're in this weird-ass life cycle. They're being used as host bodies like an infection. The only problem is they're talking about a macrovirus. Viruses, which, by the way, by some definitions, aren't even a form of life, are unicellular. If they grew up this size, they would collapse and not be able to float around and fly. All they have to do is say, it's a parasite that grows and infects people. Remember what I said about trying to make it too complicated? But they had to say that. And here, you have this scene where Captain Janeway is in a knife fight with one of these creatures, and she's holding her off well, but I'm thinking, it's amazing that this unicellular organism can whip out its appendages like that when it's this big. And there's also the fact that their holodeck doctor decides to blow them all up with an antigen bomb that will destroy them. Yes, they did know the difference between an antigen and an antibody. Bing! You see my problem here. Now, in fairness to Star Trek, they did eventually learn their lessons. Because in recent years, with a show like Star Trek Discovery, there's an episode where they're having to, and in this episode it's set about 1,000 years in the future, and they're having to deal with this poor race. They are saying how they're suffering from a disease, and it is a real known disease and they're being infected by prions. Have you ever heard those? And for those who don't know, what prions are, they're malformed proteins. They're ones that don't come together correctly. And what happens is they can build up plaques. And things like mad cow disease is because of prions. And what happens is when they're in your brain or in your substance, when any more proteins are being formed, they do a domino effect where they screw with their folding, and nothing gets made, and you get the buildup of plaques and you go crazy. And right now, currently, there's no known cure. However, here, the writers were smart enough to say, we need to see what a healthy version of the protein is supposed to look like. We need to know where the disease came from. So there is the storyline. It's very logical. It came from plants, and they found like they ate it from this infect that got mutated. We have to find the correct version, or else we can't cure these people. So there it is. Good, clean, logical science based on real ideas. And you can see how that works if you just read up on these sort of things. Now, and to continue, I'm going to touch on a show which I only recently heard about preparing for this. I was telling everybody, this is a brand new, first time I've ever done this. So excuse me if I make some flubs. And that's a show called Regenesis. Have you ever heard of it? It's a Canadian show. And the interesting thing is, it's sort of like less sci-fi-ish X-Files, not quite so. But the important thing is, they were basically like a special task force for the Canadian version of the CDC. And they actually had as their consultant a gentleman named Alec Edwards, who was their scientific advisor, and he made some very special conditions, saying, I will be your scientific consultant, but I have two conditions. What first, since this is an 18+ panel, I get to be a little more colorful with my language. He said basically, I don't want any bullshit fake science. Everything has to be based on something real. And if I don't like it, it doesn't go in the script. You change it, or I'm walking. He was like a leading molecular biologist in Canada. The other thing is, I don't want any compressed time. If I say this takes a week for somebody to test for it, it takes a week in your story. He was very insistent on it. And this group is looking at all these interesting phenomena. And one of the things that they did in the premiere episode is that you had this plague carrying around. And it turned out the source of the plague was this newborn that this woman had. And what happened was, because she had the baby inside her, she developed a natural immunity. And this baby was engineered with a special hybrid virus between Ebola and cowpox. And so nobody could trace it. And there's a thing called, excuse me for getting too technical here. When you have DNA, you have what's known as three bases that translates into an amino acid. And there is a thing called a wobble effect, where in a lot of cases, you can actually have different combinations of bases translating into the same amino acid. So basically what this engineer did, this evil person who wanted to spread a plague, he actually did alternate genes, so that way they wouldn't be able to recognize right away that they were being infected with Ebola, with a mutant version of Ebola. And the baby was engineered, and they gave the baby something to give it immunity, and what's known as silencer inhibitor RNAs, that will cut up, and that's real. So that's like the whole point. You had this, that's why it's called baby bomb. And unfortunately, by the end of the two-parter, that baby had to be isolated for the rest of its life because it was too dangerous to expose. And the mom is all in a depression because she got used and exploited by some evil organization in order to have this. The other interesting thing called spare parts was about this kid who was convinced he was a clone. And he went to the scientist to say, I think I'm a clone because my twin brother and I found out we don't have the same birthday year. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, back cloning on that level didn't seem possible because this kid was like maybe 14. So 1990, that really was very hard. That was still too early stages. But this guy knew his father was a genius. And it turns out he wasn't a clone. What he was he and his wife had extra embryos in deep freeze. His first son, had developed an immune disorder like leukemia. So he took out one of the other embryos, did a little genetic fiddling so he could be a donor for his first son. And because he did these genetic manipulations, not only did the first son end up dying, he didn't get anything compatible enough, the other son developed other diseases and was destined to die. And by the way, that is also why you have to be very careful about genetic engineering. And that's something that is always talked about in our circles that they're very particular about. Now, let's talk about the Andromeda strain. Are you all familiar with that? Basically, what they're doing is an alien virus lands, and then there was a team that was brought in to try to investigate it and break down its physiology. And it's all very done well. It's written by Michael Crichton. The late Michael Crichton had an MD degree. Some man always likes to do his research. I respect that. Never liked the man personally. I will get to it later. Why? It's important. But what is really great about this movie is that it really portrays accurately the facilities they have to work in. It's what's known as a level 4 security risk, which that means if something goes wrong, you're in lockdown and you're on your own because what you're dealing with is too lethal to risk saving you. And there was a nice breakdown, and at the time, that was everything that was up to date at the time, 1971. And that's what I always like about this movie. It's well researched, it's well thought, and you also have to think about, we're dealing with an alien, we're dealing with things that we don't know, and we have to think about the risks. So, you can see, like I said, it's not all negative today, I'm not all hating on these. We're gonna start on the next one. This is a little more interesting play, what I call seeking out new life, or how do we portray different species that are not humans or not normal in our timeline? Remember I said, I kept saying I'm going to pick on Star Trek a lot. It's interesting how sometimes the original Star Trek, for me, does a better job on biology because they not only were researching, they were almost, remember I said, use common sense when you write it. And one example I like about this is this episode called Devil in the Dark, where basically they're on a planet that could be a mining gold mine, except they don't have the facilities. And they meet this alien that can burrow through rocks like we could walk through water. And it's made on silicon, not carbon. And everybody throughout the episode, what are you talking about? That's a scientific impossibility. And then somebody says, maybe it doesn't know that. And that's the interesting point. Like, they don't delve too hard how you can have a silicon-based life form. They always know that that's out of the realm of our thinking. They acknowledge that. And ironically, the creature gets injured during the episode, and Dr. McCoy comes down and cures it by using cement as a bandage because it's silicon. Makes sense. So that's why I said, remember I said internal logic is important. It makes sense. It doesn't have, they're not trying to explain how is it possible. That's not the point. They're acknowledging, though, that it is outside of our thinking. Now, I'm going to go hit the realms of pure fantasy, but this is a great example about how you break down a new species in a fun but intelligent, logical way.
Make it a crab.
How many have you ever seen this movie? It's called Flight of Dragons. It was, as you see, 1982. It starred John Ritter, the late John Ritter. It also featured the voices of James Earl Jones, James Gregory. And basically what happens is, this guy, he's a scientist, and through the spell casting, because there's a battle in the olden days when magic was thriving, he gets transported and his mind, his consciousness gets zapped into a dragon. And he's having to learn how to be a dragon. And this other dragon is teaching him, the red one is teaching him. And he figures out how dragons, logically, how is it possible for dragons to breathe fire and fly? And they actually present this logic where they say, dragons have to eat limestone and the diamonds to help crunch it, in order to generate hydrogen gas in their system, which helps them to float because their wings aren't strong enough to carry their weight. And they actually can create a spark of electricity to ignite the hydrogen to breathe fire. So somebody was actually thinking, how could we really explain everything? And then you find he's all giddy because, oh, this explains this and this explains that and that explains that. And that's the whole point, that they were trying to give an explanation. How could a real dragon work in this fantasy setting? So again, it's about logic. And then it's easier to suspend your disbelief. And speaking of logic, I'm going to go way back before most of you were born. 1965, and the TV show The Avengers. Now there was a very science fiction show called The Man-Eater of Surrey Green, where they encountered literally a man-eating planet from outer space. And what is interesting is what the writer Philip Levine did to make it believable that the creature was what it was. And at the very beginning of the episode, there are scientists who are being mind controlled and being sucked away, presumably by this plant. And what happens is, and all this secrecy, it's building machine, it's being fed and nurtured. Our heroes find another seedling that was crushed. And they bring in scientists to start examining it. And one of the things that the scientist, this lady here, Dr. Shelton, I'm not much of a hardcore, I remember everybody's names, but she finds that when she looks at the tissue sample, that this plant has cells identical to brain cells in its system, which means it can think, which also explains how can it have telepathic abilities to mind control. The other thing is because she said it's likened to a beanstalk plant that germinates. And that's what it was. It was floating out in space and it hit something and landed on the earth. And so if this is a beanstalk, the size of the seed was such that it would be the equivalent, when it gets fully grown, it would be the equivalent about the Empire State Building. Because, the seed is tiny and this is like 10 feet across. And then they introduced the idea that it had an unusual enzyme. And the only substrate that the enzyme attacks that exists on the planet is in human beings. And then the doctor just said, no, they made up an enzyme for the sake of the story. But they said, it's a good thing we only found one of these. Why? Because this plant would need people like we would need green vegetables. And they went, uh-oh. But it's still a plant, and so like any plant, it can be killed with an appropriate herbicide, which is how they defeated it at the end. So again, internal logic that allows you to suspend disbelief, even though, it's fantasy. Plants in real life don't have a high enough brain function to have that kind of racial memories to be able to control. All right, I'm going to talk about one I like, but had turned into a problematic situation. That's the xenomorph from Alien. Now, when it was originally conceived in 1979, it was in flights of fancy. But they took an idea that this was a parasite, and they had a very clean life cycle where it's waiting in this larval form to attack a host, inject, grow, and then the pupal stage comes out, it feeds, it becomes full adult, and it can use another person to inject and to create into that larval state that it begins with. And that was all very clean, and actually when you think about it from a parasitic life cycle, it's actually very logical. And it would also explain why these things have not spread across the galaxy like crazy, because they are kind of limited. And then James Cameron got his hands on the story when he did the sequel and decided to have to be a hive scenario with a queen that lays eggs. And then after that, they do the scenario, well, they're actually kind of like, they change according to whatever they host. And then after that, we're going to change their rheology. And it goes crazier and crazier and crazier. And when you have the sequels with Prometheus, it just kind of really gets out of hand when originally what they had in mind was actually the most sensible and believable and scariest. And you can even understand, like, okay, you got acid for blood because their own natural skin is resistant to the acid. Okay, all right, I'll give you that. That's, but what they say. But you can see how when the more complicated they make the life cycle, the more asked the question is, how come they have not dominated the environment better? If they're so powerful and efficient, where the original life cycle makes more sense. It's like a worm ain't gonna go anywhere if there isn't a host. And that is where it's just like, that's where you get carried away. And sometimes simplicity is the best. Now, next we're gonna talk about evolution and eugenics, which is a favorite often topic in science fiction. And I'm gonna start out simple. Who watches Doctor Who? Okay. I'm going to talk about a story called City of Death, which I think is a really great serial from 1979. And basically, Douglas Adams co-wrote it. And basically, he had the idea of that the life on Earth, the spark that generated the life on Earth, was caused by the explosion of an alien ship. Perfectly good, viable idea. Except for one little detail. He was off about 4 billion years. He kept saying it happened 400 million years ago. And the current dogma is that life on this earth started 4 billion years ago. So, we're off by a zero. and that is the only flaw I'm gonna say. It's a good premise, and it is logical, but you get this, that's not right. And it's like, and it's an easy fix. That's what's kind of annoying about it. It's an easy fix that no one bothered with. So, now, back to Star Trek. I'm picking on Star Trek again. Now, first I want to say, I've always found this episode for the Next Generation very enjoyable. Gates McFadden, who played Dr. Crusher, directed it, made a nice horror story, but in which the crew are getting devolved because one of the crew members was injected with a T cell that mutated and started regressing the evolutionary. And Data is explaining to the captain, oh, what happens is, like, their introns are getting compromised and affected. That's why they're regressing. And the captain says, well, what are introns? Oh, those are dormant genes. And here I am going, no. Dormant genes are dormant genes. Introns are intervening sequences that actually don't get transcribed. If the only role that they potentially play is in regulation of gene synthesis and replication. This wouldn't happen. I'm setting aside the whole thing about de-evolving, like that, okay. It's easier for me to close my brain off on that one. The fact that, how about you just do your homework? Do your homework. So, otherwise, it's actually a very entertaining episode. I don't blame Gates McFadden on that. Now, back to Star Trek again, Next Generation, there's an episode called The Chase. And I'm willing to always give this one a pass. Evolutionary biologists hate this episode because the basic premise is that many of the known species have a common ancestor that were scattered by this ancient race from 5 billion years ago. And they said, no, they wouldn't. Like even the differentials between their genomes are too different for compatibility and for that kind of change. And so evolutionary biologists get really pissy about this because, of course, that's their craft and their specialty. And I personally always give them a pass for one basic reason is not because the science is good, but because the concept and the theme behind it is so classically Star Trek about unity and commonality and peace that, okay, I'm willing to forgive you for that because that's the point, that's the bigger theme. And they don't try too hard to hammer the whole thing about the genetic aspects of it. They play with the fact that we all have more in common, and we should be okay with that. That should be more, that's very Federation talk. So, but, we're now going to talk about Gattaca. How many of you have ever seen Gattaca? Okay, now I bring this one up, not because they don't really delve a lot into the science, but they do deal with something that's very important to us, and that's bioethics. And the reality is, of course, the whole idea of, the whole idea of the eugenics thing and crossbreeding and who is acceptable and what is acceptable in society, because the fact is that the movie acknowledges that even though it's against the law to discriminate against people based on your genetics, there's still a caste system. And they hide behind science, like insurance companies hide behind, oh, you have this pre-existing condition, we don't want to risk you, you're not insurable. When that's like telling Stephen Hawking, we're not going to accept you in school because, well, you've got an illness. Or Teddy Roosevelt, considered one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history, an environmentalist who was a jock, was born with asthma and was puny as a child. And it's like telling them, you don't have any hopes for great leadership, don't bother. And that is the whole idea, and that's touching on bioethics in a way, in a very dramatic and interesting way. So that's what I like about this one, that's why I bring it up, is that you cannot, there is things called environments. It goes back to that whole idea once said, like, yeah, you could like nurture a whole bunch of Michael Jordans, but there was a lot of his personal history that made Michael Jordan Michael Jordan. And that's the same similar ideas that they theme with Ethan Hawke. And by the way, Gattaca is a play on DNA secrets. That's where it is from. That's why they did it. Okay, and speaking of eugenics, back to Star Trek. Yes, I'm picking on. And there's an episode called The Masterpiece Society, where they're trying to do the same things, where they're being critical of eugenics and crossbreed and selective breedings. And the problem with it, because it goes back to that idea of how the Nazis 100 years ago wanted to do like selective breed with people, like they do with sheep. And at least back then, they didn't have the excuse. They had the excuse of not knowing enough about science. How that doesn't work. Where here they're critiquing it, but they're actually creating scientists that actually are very short-sighted. That created this society where they live on a planet that has a shield that they can't leave. They're supposedly linked to their environment, and they basically removed free will, in which everybody is like programmed for careers, predestined. And the flaw, that is where the flaw in the story is, because for those of you who don't know, neurological behavior, while it does have a genetic component and factor, there's no single one or two genes that are going to make you like playing the piano or want you to like be a leader or a politician. Those things are very complex. And so that's what I mean by short-sighted. It wouldn't work. And it would have been more interesting if you have this healthy, thriving society and create a society that is so interdependent on each other that if a few people leave, you're saying it's going to collapse. That makes it kind of stupid in your design. It's not good science in the design itself. And that's the problem I have with it. Yes?
Did you say that in the story they determined what people would do based on genetics?
Yes, genetics and breeding they engineered they engineered the genetics that would make you a good politician, a good lawyer, a good musician. And they leave out the fact that, excuse me, I know scientists who play rock music. I know there was an actress who was a successful fashion designer and got awards. They don't allow the idea that, they make the argument, what if you're someone who wants to be a poet, but you're bad at it? And say, so what? Like, I'm a molecular biologist, but as a hobby, I do photography. And you see the disconnects. So that's what I'm talking about. it's the plot of making these scientists so short-sighted that's very frustrating, because as opposed to doing a story in which, how about you have a society that thrives? And then you question the ethics about, do we interfere? You know, where there are good points to also match the questionable points. Now, I will say these scientists are not the dumbest scientists that were ever presented on television. I'm about to show you the dumbest scientists that were ever on science. And they were still on Star Trek. This is from season 2, called Unnatural Selection, in which what happened was, they find there's a virus which are making people old, screwing with their immune system, blah, 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 blah. And they suspect, they trace to this facility where apparently they're trying to make super children. Smart, intelligent, telepathic, skills. They can get to adulthood twice as fast as a normal human being. And it turns out the children are the ones who are spreading the disease, because they said, oh, we engineered to give them a very aggressive immune system. They don't wait for a disease to come to them, they seek it out. And then I'm going, and supposedly, okay, first of all, your T cells and your antibodies would not be able to leave the frickin' body because the skin is a two-way barrier. It's the very thing that protects you, first of all. Secondly, anything that is not you would be considered antibodies and T cells and whatnot attack what's called non-self, foreign matter. Anything outside of your body is foreign matter. So that, even if you figure out a way, this body to get through your skin, anyone around you will get infected. That is basic immunology. Dumbest scientist on television. I was a student in college and I knew better. So that's what I hate. That's what I mean about do your homework. And plus, these kids, and first of all, why would you have these kids age twice as speed when their emotional development will not be double? They're dumbest scientists on television. Okay, let's talk about cloning and genetic engineering. The thing about cloning is, unfortunately, is how a lot of misconceptions historically on science fiction. And a perfect example is what I call from Spider-Man Night of the Clones, where they always want to say that there's a magical machine that can create a copy of you with your memories intact, and you look exactly alike, and this is a situation where this happened, except it's an evil clone. That doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. Over 20 years later, Arnold is doing a movie, same thing, magical machine that creates a copy of you, full grown, same memories. Here's the reality. Cloning is basically a form of making a twin, that we used what nature gives you. And they used the natural machine. You can't still be full grown and have memories. Where the hell are the memories coming from? And it would be like having a twin that was born 25 years later. And it's just going to grow and develop on its own naturally. Normal age cycles, presumably. So, that is like the first big myth, and it was really a long time before that myth was broken. Even Star Trek did that. They're perpetuating the thing about a magical machine. It's not magical. It's very complex science. It's very tricky. It's dangerous work if you don't. And it's not, and I'll tell you something, when they had the first cloned animal, there was a lot of ambitious, greedy quacks trying to capitalize on that and take advantage of people. Now, on that whole concept of cloning, remember I said you can't have the memories going back. This is why I bring up Boys from Brazil. Written by Ira Levin. He also wrote, The Stepford Wives. and a couple other thrillers. What happens is you have Joseph Mengele developing cloning decades before anybody else. And so there's like 70, 80 clones of Hitler that he sends up. But he's smart, but the story, this is the part why I bring it up. He wants to make sure that he produces a Hitler. So he said, each one of these has to relive Hitler's life. So he sets up in families and situations very similar as possible to Hitler, the same kind of parents, the fact that when he's 10, 12 years old, Hitler's father gets killed. So we're at a point in the story where he sends out people to kill the adoptive fathers because psychologically he wants to create the same mindset. And it's interesting in the story where some of those clones don't behave exactly the same way, as you would expect them to, because they're separate individuals. And that is the nice thing. Now, memorize that I don't like Michael Crichton as a person, but I respect him as a researcher. And we're going to talk about Jurassic Park. And how I'm going to talk about is the book versus the film. Now, like with Andromeda Strain, the book is very well researched about the technology at the time. How could you do a clone of any? And I will give him great hats off to him for the amount of input he did. And I remember my roommate at the time, he was a big Michael Crichton fan. He said, oh, you got to read this, read it. And I read it because, you're a molecular biologist. You'll really appreciate this. And I read it, and I said to him very casually, this is just one big pulp novel. And what really, the problem I have with it, the book, less extent than the movie, I'll get to the movie in a second, is that this story is so biased. Because going into it, Michael Crichton already tells you in the foreword, he hates people in my profession, in biotechnology. He thinks anybody who's in the biotechnology profession are greedy bastards and fake, where scientists used to be noble and pursue for the sake of knowledge. I will tell you from experience, from talking to those scientists back where he praises, that is bullshit. I have talked to scientists back then, they welcomed it. They welcomed any technology, they welcomed any advances, because back in those noble days, what today would take days took months. What took to do? They welcomed it. They wanted that because it made life simpler. So that's where the BS comes. And what really upsets me is that he purposely has the people in the book, and also translates over in the movie, doing bad science. Like, the basic approach of how he had the clone is what's known as shotgunning. You just put in and see what sticks. Perfectly fine, normal. But it is also standard procedure to see what genes stuck, what are they. It's what's known as a blast search. They didn't do that. And it's like thinking, any grad student knows this. It's standard procedure. Because how are you going to reproduce it and how do you know that there isn't something in there that will cause illness or sickness or shorten the lifespan? Let's put aside the fact that the story is set in contemporary times and it only took them not even somewhere between 5 to 10 years to grow the dinosaurs. Let's put that aside. It's like the intentional use of bad science, that his characters were doing bad science. And that carries over in the movie. But what's fortunate is that the movie at least downplays some of that. Now, it also puts in a couple of annoying characters, and that's where at least, that's what helps in the film. The film downplays some of the bad elements in the book, but it has its own share. Now, I did enjoy the movie. I want to say that right now. It's just, but speaking from someone in my profession, that storyline is very upsetting because it is so artificial. And for him to say, we're greedy bastards when, excuse me, how much money did you sell the movie rights for? After he came out with Jurassic Park, he sold the movie rights to his to a future book that didn't even have a title for $3 million. Do not sit there and judge me. Okay, but anyway, remember I said cloning is a very tricky thing. And the one series I feel that really captured the nuances, but still in a fantasy entertainment platform, is the show Orphan Black. Have you ever seen it? And it is where basically stars Tatiana Maslany, Emmy Award winner for this show, hardest working actress ever. She was playing 10 different clones, each of them with their own personalities, their own back histories, and they're the result of an experiment, a cloning experiment. They're all clones. They also, and they didn't suddenly pop out of a machine. They're all different because they're in different environments. But also, like remember I said, cloning is very tricky. They actually suffer an illness, which one of them, who's a scientist, is desperately trying to find a cure for. And those are like the realities. And scientists even said this is the most realistic approach about the realities of cloning and what it'd be like. Because when Dolly, the sheep, was first cloned, there was a lot of questions. Like, first of all, how old is Dolly really? Because she was taken from adult tissue. Is she actually a newborn? Or is she actually, did she start out 2 years old? And she actually died young. And what about her kids? Are her kids going to be okay? Her grandkids, her great-grandchildren. And also, people kind of forget, going back about that magical machine, Dolly was the first successful out of about 400 tries. And there wasn't like suddenly, oh, she's the one that stuck. No. We're talking about reducing, like out of those 400, 200 made it past the first trimester. Out of those 200, less than half of those made it to birth. Out of those, only 10% made it made it even halfway through childhood. And out of those, only Dolly made it survive to adulthood. That's why I said the whole issue about bioethics and things like that. There is no magical machine. It's very tricky, it's very dangerous, and this is the first show that really attempted to touch on that. Now, I am going to zoom in really quick because I've been talking a lot, because I'm going to go really things what I call problematic miracles, where, remember I said, sometimes you try too hard, and then it makes it suspending your disbelief hard. Marvel superheroes. Now, we know this is pure fantasy, but about 40 years ago, they came up with this book called The Guide to the Marvel Universe, where they decided, we're going to use real science to explain everything. And then after a while, it ends up this can of worms, like the fact that when they say, well, Wolverine, his skeleton is all made out of adamantium steel. How can he move in the cold weather then? And then they said Cyclops, who does, originally he shoots eye beams out of his eyes, his source of his energy is the sun. They decided, well, his eyes are actually an aperture to an alternate dimension. That's where the energy comes from. And there's another meme who can change into steel. And they said he actually exchanges his carbon atoms for these steel atoms from an alternate dimension. So what if he moves? How does he get them back? You see about that can of worms. Captain Jack Harkness, there's another problematic miracle. When they first introduced it, it was basically Time Lord magic. And then you can accept it. By the end of the show, they said, well, it's his blood and his physiology has been changed and we can pass it on to everybody and it can be sparked because there's a magical vagina on the earth. And it's like, midichlorians. Again, Jedi's, when it first started, it was supposed to be magical and mystical. And suddenly George Lucas we need a biological explanation for midichlorians. It's the midichlorians in their cells. That's the secret of the Force. And if you have at least 20,000 of them, you can tap into the Force. But there's just go with the spiritual aspects. By the way, according to legal, what happened to those mystical religious aspects of it that everyone was happy with? And by the way, also, according to federal guidelines, being Jedi Knight philosophy qualifies as a religion. Now, I'm going to end with something on a very positive note. The X-Files. The X-Files is the first show I ever saw, major TV show, that actually did good, interesting incorporation of biology. And I'm going to round off some samples. First season, they had proof of an alien species by using DNA sequencing. Normally in human being, in all life on this planet, you got 4 bases, ACGT, making up your DNA. They found one, a species, tissue, where there were 2 extra bases. And they just used technology at the time, like, yeah, this ain't human. This didn't come from Earth. You see, that's different from some other things. Oh, and they did have a scientific advisor, Anne Simon. She actually wrote a book years later about all her time on the show. Protein tagging and immunohistone staining, where apparently the government had a project where they were tracking people who were part of their experiments. And they were using an inoculation and the tags for the proteins to give them cowpox, smallpox immunity. And they went so far, and when they ran off the sequence in the episode, some scientists thought he could outsmart them, so this is probably nonsense. And when he plugged it into the machine, it was an actual sequence for smallpox immunity. That's how thorough they were. Now, on a sillier note, they did their own version of a Frankenstein story with Cher, well, the presence of Cher. They used the whole thing where there's mutants. They based it on what's known as Hox genes. Hox genes are development genes, which are very critical on normal development in animals. And they kept referencing, in fact, Chris Carter, who wrote this, did his research about Hox genes and how he could extrapolate that. In a more recent episode, when they revived the show, CRISPR. That is a real thing. When you can do DNA editing, gene therapy, and that's how they were passing in an evil virus. But the whole point is, that's real technology that exists today. That's been for many years. And many biotech companies use that to help with gene therapy. And the whole point about this is what I'm leading up to, is what's known as the Scully effect, in which apparently a lot of women got into STEM, science, technology, engineering programs, because of Dana Scully. And let me tell you something, one thing that I got giddy on back in the 90s, and I've always wanted to tell this to Gillian Anderson, or if she even realized, there is a sequence where she's trying to isolate proof, and she has a sample, and she is doing what is back then is known as a Southern blot, where you're probing genetic material, isolating from an organism. And there's a video montage of her correctly doing every step. I know because I've done the same procedure myself back in the 90s. They even got those same radioactive dye. The bottle was correct because I had the same brand in my lab. That is good science. Now, granted, she did it in 3 hours instead of 2 days, but every step is correct. And that is the point where you can see where I'm headed, where when you do good science, it had great effects. Ask the 20 or 30% of the women who are in science today. Thank you.